What if the black stars you idolized growing up spent their lives afraid to love openly? The voices that shaped music, the faces that reshaped Hollywood, the men who made you laugh, cry, and dream big. For decades, they smiled on stage, posed for the camera, played the roles the world wanted them to, all the while hiding a truth so dangerous at the time that it could have destroyed their careers overnight. Their stories are more complicated, more heartbreaking, and more powerful than the headlines ever made. And by the end of this video, you may never listen to their songs or watch their movies the same way again. When we talk about the birth of rock and roll, we talk about Little Richard. He didn't just sing, he set the stage on fire. With every scream, every piano smash, every jewel-encrusted suit, he pushed boundaries in ways no one else dared. Millions of fans idolized him, copied his look, stole his sound, and built entire careers around the musical blueprint he created. But there's one thing they rarely talk about, something the industry, and even Little Richard himself, spent their lives trying to erase: his sexuality. Little Richard wasn't just closeted, he was locked in a constant battle between desire and denial. From an early age, he knew he was different. Growing up in Macon, Georgia, in the 1930s and 40s, being black was dangerous. But being black and gay, it was a sentence society would not forgive. Richard's strict religious upbringing had drilled into him one thing: homosexuality was a sin. His father, a church deacon by day and nightclub owner by night, rejected him for being weak, kicked him out of the house when he was just a teenager. Imagine being 15, broke, homeless, and carrying the burden of feeling like God, your family, and the world were against you. But Richard had one weapon: his music. And when fame finally came, with it came a strange kind of freedom and an even stranger kind of cage. On stage, he could be flamboyant, wear makeup, scream sexually suggestive lyrics, and the world would applaud him. But as soon as the music stopped, the mask would be put back on. Being queer-coded was one thing. Being openly gay in the 1950s music industry, that was career suicide. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he would speak his truth. In candid interviews, he would laugh about his wild days with men, about the orgies and the nightlife, about sneaking around with lovers his fans would never know about. But then, almost like clockwork, the shame would set in. He would continue his religious tirades, openly condemn homosexuality, call it unnatural, and claim to be saved all over again. This back and forth not only confused fans, it was emotionally devastating for Richard himself. He went through periods of self-loathing, throwing away personal belongings that reminded him of past relationships, dropping friends, cutting ties with people who loved him for who he was. All because, deep down, he believed that God would never forgive him for being gay. But the world kept watching, keeping buying records, keeping cheering for the wild man of rock and roll, never knowing the full price he was paying inside. By the time the LGBTQ+ movement gained real momentum, Little Richard was older, tired, and still unwilling or unable to fully embrace the label that had defined him in his private life for so long. When he died in 2020, tributes poured in from around the world. Musicians, fans, and even LGBTQ+ activists celebrated him as a queer icon. But the saddest truth? Richard never got to live his full, authentic self in public. Not even in the final chapters of his life. And here's the frustrating part. If someone as powerful, influential, groundbreaking as Little Richard felt unable to come out, how many others are still hiding to this day? Let us know what you think in the comments below. When we talk about voices that shook American society, James Baldwin stands in a class of his own. A literary genius, a fearless civil rights advocate, and a man whose words still resonate in classrooms, protests, and political speeches today. But behind his sharp intellect and fearless commentary on race and injustice, Baldwin carried a personal pain: his struggles as a black gay man in America. Born in Harlem in 1924, Baldwin grew up under the strict supervision of a devoutly religious stepfather, a preacher who believed that fear and discipline were the tools to keep a boy on the right path. But even as a child, Baldwin knew he didn't fit that mold. His love of literature, his sensitivity, and his attraction to other boys set him apart from an early age. The church was both a refuge and a prison. By his teenage years, he knew that who he was would never be accepted within those walls or outside on the streets of 1940s America, where being black and gay was a double sentence. So Baldwin left. In the late 1940s, he flew to Paris in pursuit of freedom and breathing room. For the first time, he found a place where he could exist more openly, at least than he had at home. But the thing is, even in Paris, Baldwin rarely labeled himself. He wrote about homosexual desire, male love, isolation, and longing with revolutionary honesty. His 1956 novel, Giovanni's Room, is now a classic of gay literature. But back then, it almost cost him his career. Publishers warned him. Writing about homosexual love would alienate black readers and everyone else. But Baldwin, never one to follow the rules, published it anyway. And while critics praised the book, it also fueled speculation about his personal life. That's where things got complicated. Baldwin never stood on a podium and shouted, "I'm gay." No interviews, no public essays asserting that label. Instead, he let his characters speak for him. Their pain, their longing, their anger became a silent confession. And at a time when coming out could ruin your career, or worse, it was an act of defiance. His friends and writing colleagues knew, his lovers knew, his colleagues in Paris and New York knew. But to the public, Baldwin remained a brilliant, enigmatic writer who spoke about race but remained silent about the details of his heart. Even near the end, as the LGBTQ+ movement grew, Baldwin eschewed labels. He once said, "I've always believed that labels are dangerous. I'd rather not be called anything at all." But for many black LGBTQ+ artists today, Baldwin is more than a literary icon. He is a symbol of survival. Proof that even when the world tries to erase you, your voice and legacy can still transcend. So what do you think? Was Baldwin's silence about his sexuality, fear, or quiet rebellion? Let us know in the comments, because this conversation still matters. When Luther Vandross sang about love, millions believed he was singing directly to them. With every lyric, every note, he captured longing, hope, heartbreak, and passion, in a way few artists could. Hits like Never Too Much and Dance with My Father became timeless anthems, played at weddings, family gatherings, and lonely nights. But behind that soothing voice and those soulful love songs, Luther carried a secret heavier than any heartbreak he ever sang about: his sexuality. Born in New York City in 1951, Luther grew up surrounded by music, but also by expectations. In the R&B world of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, being a black male singer meant being masculine, sexy, and above all, heterosexual. Record labels marketed him as the dream man of millions of female fans. And Luther lived up to that. In interviews, he dodged every personal question about relationships, never confirming, never denying, just smiling, redirecting the conversation and letting fans imagine whatever story they wanted. But how long could a person live like that without falling apart inside? Behind the scenes, friends, colleagues, and industry insiders knew the truth. Luther was gay, and he lived with the constant fear that coming out would destroy the career he had worked so hard to build. One of his closest friends, singer Patti LaBelle, later revealed that Luther feared losing his female fan base. He was terrified that the women who clung to his every love song would leave him as soon as they learned the truth. And perhaps even more heartbreaking, he worried about what his mother would think. His family's acceptance weighed heavily on him, perhaps even more than the public. Bruce Vilanch, a writer and friend of Hollywood, once recalled Luther describing his double life. In public, he was the epitome of love songs. In private, he carried the pain of isolation, secrets, and self-denial. Do you think, in a different era, with a different industry, Luther would have found the courage to live openly? Luther never married, never had a public relationship with a woman, and never let his fans know his truth. Even as HIV and AIDS ravaged the black LGBTQ community in the 80s and 90s, Luther remained silent, carefully navigating a world that refused to let black men, especially famous ones, live authentically. his health struggles only deepened the mystery. After a devastating stroke in 2003, Luther stopped making public appearances. And in 2005, the world lost one of the greatest voices in music history. It wasn't until after his death, friends and industry insiders, that the truth many suspected was quietly acknowledged. His voice told the world how to love. But in his own life, he sang those songs from behind a wall. A wall built by fear, by the pressures of the industry, and by a society that wasn't ready for men like him to live their lives to the fullest. And that's perhaps the most heartbreaking legacy of all. The man who gave millions the soundtrack to their love stories never got the chance to write his own. Richard Pryor was a man who made the world laugh at its ugliest realities. Addiction, racism, domestic violence, poverty, the things most people run from. Pryor ran straight for putting them on stage and daring America to look. He stripped comedy to its core, told stories that made people uncomfortable, and still made them laugh. But there was one subject, a dark corner of his life, that even Pryor couldn't wrap up in a joke: his sexuality. Born in 1940 in Peoria, Illinois, Richard grew up in chaos. His grandmother ran a brothel. His earliest memories? Violence, prostitution, addiction, and survival. As a teenager, he saw things most grown men never saw. And while other boys were learning how to date girls, Richard learned how to hide, how to distract, how to weaponize humor to hide the parts of himself that felt too dangerous to express. On stage, Pryor was fearless. He joked about everything, even his own near-death experiences, even the darkest corners of his drug use, even setting himself on fire in a freebase accident. But whenever the subject of sex and identity came up, he turned it into something else: a joke, a distraction, a joke designed to distract. In some of his stand-up routines, Pryor hinted at being with men. The comments were swift, the stories were told with a smirk and a wink, leaving the audience guessing, is he serious? Or is this just Richard being outrageous again? And maybe that was the goal, keeping it vague enough so no one really knew. But here's the heartbreaking part. He was serious. In private, close friends knew the truth. In his diaries, Pryor wrote openly about his attraction to men, his experiences, his confusion, and his shame. For him, it wasn't about identity labels, it was about survival, and the overwhelming fear that if the public knew, it would all fall apart. And in 1980s America, for a black comedian at the height of his fame, those fears were not unfounded. Then came the revelation that no one saw coming. Years after Pryor's death, music mogul Quincy Jones accidentally dropped a bombshell in an interview, suggesting that Richard Pryor had a romantic and sexual relationship with none other than Marlon Brando. The media exploded. Fans were stunned. The internet was awash with headlines. But the one who confirmed it with quiet certainty was Pryor's widow, Jennifer Lee Pryor. She said Richard was not ashamed, not in private. He joked about it with friends, wrote about it in his diary. It was just something the rest of the world was never allowed to know. And perhaps that is the real tragedy here. For a man who built his entire career on radical honesty, who bared his soul night after night to millions of strangers, Richard Pryor still died with much of himself locked away. Can you imagine how exhausting that must be? Standing under bright lights, making the world laugh, while inside you're drowning in silence? Some say the reason Pryor pushed himself so hard, living so recklessly, burned so many bridges, it was because deep down he never believed he deserved peace, or love, or even forgiveness. And maybe that's why. When we watch his old comedy shows now and hear him joke about sex, those laughs, they sound a little different, a little sadder, like a man laughing just to keep from crying. When Johnny Mathis sang about love, it felt like love that transcended time, soft, innocent, and universal. For generations, couples have slow danced to his voice. Weddings, anniversaries, first dates. His songs have become the soundtrack to millions of love stories. But the truth, most of those fans never knew at the time. While Johnny Mathis was transmitting the language of love to the world, he was not allowed to speak publicly about his own love. Born in 1935 in Gilmer, Texas, and raised in San Francisco, Johnny was a natural performer from an early age. By the late 1950s, he was a household name. His ballads were topping the charts, his face was on magazine covers, and millions of women dreamed of being the one Johnny sang for. But who was Johnny really? He lived quietly, privately, and yes, as a gay man. In an era when even the rumor of homosexuality could end a career overnight, Johnny chose to remain silent, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation and perhaps out of wisdom. Have you ever wondered how many artists of that era made the same choice? Not because they wanted to hide, but because they wanted to survive? Mathis never staged dramatic denials. He never played the tabloid game. He simply refused to discuss his personal life. But in 1982, something changed. In an interview with Us magazine, Mathis casually, almost accidentally, admitted that he was gay. The industry, the media, they weren't ready. The article was buried, the world moved on, and Mathis went back to doing what he did best: singing, performing, and minding his own business. It wasn't until decades later, when conversations about LGBTQ+ became more open, fans and journalists came back, asking, why don't we talk about this more? Why isn't Johnny Mathis celebrated as one of the first black celebrities to come out? His answer was as gentle as his music. He says he never felt the need to make a big statement, that his sexuality was just a part of who he was, not a headline, not a scandal, not a marketing tool. And in a way, that quiet dignity became his rebellion. At a time when the world wanted drama, Johnny gave it grace. When others felt compelled to lie, he simply chose not to say anything. Today, looking back, Mathis is both a pioneer and a reminder. Coming out looks different to everyone. For some, it's a front-page story. For others, it's a gentle confession, wrapped in a melody. Only those who really listen will hear it. And maybe that's what Johnny Mathis is most about. Before Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, before the words "I have a dream" were immortalized, Bayard Rustin was an activist. Bayard was more than an activist. He was the architect behind the entire 1963 March on Washington. Every bus route, every volunteer list, every speaker lineup, Bayard built it all, piece by piece, knowing he would never be the face of it. And why? Because Bayard Rustin was openly gay. At a time when being black was a battle for survival, being black and gay, it was a double whammy, a risk the movement was unwilling to take. Born in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Bayard spent decades fighting for justice long before King became a household name. From the early labor movements to the anti-segregation protests, he was always on the front lines. But as his influence grew, so did the whispers. His 1953 arrest on morals charges after being caught with another man became a weapon for both the FBI and the political enemies of the civil rights movement. Leaders feared that Rustin's sexuality would be used to discredit everything they stood for. Even in King's inner circle, some pushed to sideline him. Some wanted him gone altogether. Can you imagine that choice? Pour your heart and soul into a freedom movement and then be told your love life is a burden? But Bayard didn't leave. Instead, he worked harder. He moved from the spotlight into the background, quietly directing, building, and strategizing, without applause, without recognition, and without the recognition he deserved. There's a certain kind of pain that comes from being essential, yet invisible. Bayard carried that pain for years. Even after the success of the March on Washington, Bayard's name still didn't make headlines. History books barely mentioned him. TV interviews were rarely called. While others became icons, Bayard became a footnote. But even so, he never stopped fighting. For voting rights, for labor unions, for anti-war causes, and later in life, for LGBTQ+ equality. One of his last battles was for the rights of openly gay people, long before it was politically acceptable. It wasn't until 2013, 26 years after his death, Bayard Rustin finally received national recognition. President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, calling him one of the greatest unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. Looking back, you have to ask yourself, How many Bayard Rustins are there in history? Men and women who fought for justice but had to hide, sacrifice, or step aside simply for the people they loved. Bayard believed in equality for all. He fought not just for his race, but for humanity, even when humanity wasn't ready to fight for him. His legacy, it's written between the lines of every speech, every march, and every right that we now take for granted. While most artists of the 1970s tried to fit in, Sylvester made his career by standing out. In an era of glitter balls and dance floors, he was more than just a disco voice. He was a statement, a challenge to convention, and for many, a living revolution in high heels. From the moment he stepped on stage, Sylvester James Jr. didn't just perform, he existed, loudly, unapologetically, and beautifully odd. Born in Los Angeles in 1947, Sylvester grew up singing in church choirs, a space where his powerful falsetto first attracted attention and where, ironically, he first learned that being himself came at a price. When he moved to San Francisco, he had no interest in fitting in anymore. The makeup, the sequins, the genderless fashion, everything about Sylvester exuded authenticity. And then, in the same breath, you could sense the loneliness beneath the glitter. When he sang "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real," it wasn't just a disco anthem, it was a statement. Quirky love, quirky existence, quirky joy deserves attention. But being openly gay and black in the music industry of the 1970s, it was dangerous territory. Radio stations refused to play his songs in certain markets. Promoters were hesitant to book him. Record labels didn't know how to package him. There were nights when Sylvester performed for thousands and still went home, wondering if mainstream America would ever truly embrace him. Can you imagine giving the world your voice, your truth, and still being told you're too much? But if there's one thing Sylvester never did, it was shut himself away from anyone. He used his fame to elevate the LGBTQ+ community, advocate for gay rights, perform at Pride events, and then, when the HIV/AIDS crisis hit, become one of the first black celebrities to speak out. When Sylvester was diagnosed with HIV in the mid-80s, he knew what it meant. He'd seen his friends fall ill one by one. He knew how the media portrayed people like him, as cautionary tales, as the statistics show. But even then, Sylvester was still on stage, keeping singing, keeping loving, and still fighting. In the final months of his life, as his health was failing, he made one final request. Royals from his music should go directly to HIV/AIDS charities in San Francisco. Even in death, he wanted to leave something meaningful behind, something bigger than fame. Sylvester died in 1988 at just 41. But decades later, his voice still echoes across dance floors. His legacy lives on in every queer artist, every drag artist, every person who refuses to apologize for taking up space. And perhaps that's the question we should all be asking ourselves. How many lives did Sylvester save, just by existing, without remorse? Because sometimes, just being yourself is the loudest act of protest. If you've ever been captivated by the sound of a Duke Ellington classic, chances are you've been moved by the genius of Billy Strayhorn. His melodies, light yet complex, his harmonies, rich yet subtle. Strayhorn wasn't just a composer, he was the invisible architect behind some of jazz's most timeless works. Take the A Train, that was him. Lush Life, that was him too. But while his music echoed through clubs and concert halls, Billy Strayhorn himself remained behind, not by accident, by survival. In the 1940s and 50s, being black in the music industry was a struggle enough. Being black and openly gay? That was career suicide. Unlike many of his peers, however, Strayhorn never tried to hide who he was. He didn't play the straight man. He didn't pretend to have relationships with women for photo ops. In his tight-knit circle, everyone knew. Billy loved men, and he made no apologies for it. But what's heartbreaking is how the industry treated him. Duke Ellington, though forever grateful for Strayhorn's brilliance, rarely acknowledged him publicly. Billy's name was often not on the record covers, his photos were rarely published. His interviews, hardly, and part of that was the times they lived in. Jazz was already a racially charged space. Adding an openly gay black man to the spotlight, it was a risk few labels, or even Ellington himself, would take. But Strayhorn stayed, loyal, silent, pouring his heartache, his isolation, and yes, his secret love into his music. Have you ever listened to Lush Life late at night? The longing, the exhaustion, the pain of secret love. It's all there. Every note, every pause, every lyric, a coded confession for those who care to listen. Strayhorn's relationships were often private, fleeting, and lived in the shadows. But among friends, he was open. He brought his boyfriend to rehearsals, hold hands when he wanted to. In his own quiet way, Billy lived authentically, long before the world made room for men like him. Sadly, that world never really came into his life. Billy Strayhorn died in 1967 at just 51 of esophageal cancer. At his funeral, Duke Ellington finally said it out loud, calling him my right hand, my left hand, the eyes in my head, the brain of my heart. It was a beautiful tribute, but for many LGBTQ+ fans, it also felt too little, too late. Today, Strayhorn's legacy is being restored. His songs are being studied, celebrated, and finally his truth is being told. Because behind every iconic tune is a man, loving, longing, and living in a world that never saw him fully. To most Americans, Paul Winfield was the epitome of strength. A leading black actor in Hollywood who, let's be honest, didn't have many leading roles for men who looked like him. His performance in Sounder earned him an Academy Award nomination. His portrayal of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the King miniseries captivated audiences. On screen, Paul was everything the industry wanted him to be: classy, masculine, and above all, marketable. But behind the camera, aside from awards shows and red carpets, Paul Winfield lived a very different story. A story he never dared to share with the public. In 1970s and 1980s Hollywood, being an openly gay black man wasn't just risky, it was career-ending. Studios expected their male stars to exude heterosexual charm, to flirt in interviews, to show up at events with hand-picked female co-stars on their arms. Paul played along. At one point, he even publicly dated his Sounder co-star Cicely Tyson, a move that many later saw as damage control. But the truth was, Paul's heart was elsewhere. For more than 30 years, he was in a serious relationship with Charles Gillen Jr., an architect, a man who was not very well known in Hollywood. Their love was real, steady, quiet, and like so many other same-sex relationships of the era, it was done behind closed doors, out of fear, but never out of lack of love. Paul's close friends knew it. Industry insiders whispered it. But to the public, he was just another eligible bachelor, another Hollywood heartthrob who hadn't found the right woman. Have you ever wondered how exhausting it must have been? To build an entire career, to stand on stage and accept an award, knowing that the person who mattered most couldn't stand next to you in the spotlight. In 2002, when Charles died of cancer, those who knew Paul say he was never the same again. The man who had always held on to his public image began to withdraw. His health rapidly declined. Just 2 years later, in 2004, Paul Winfield died of a heart attack. And it wasn't until after both of their deaths that the full truth about their relationship became known to the public. There was no scandal, there was no exposure, just quiet acknowledgement from friends, and the bitter realization that Hollywood had lost not just a leading man, but a man. Like so many others who had spent his life loving in silence. Today, when we look back at Paul's career and the roles that made his name, there's something poetic and heartbreaking in knowing that the strength he displayed on screen was often a mask, hiding the vulnerability he lived with every day. And now, we come to the last name on our list. A man known to millions as the loud, bold, fast-talking George Jefferson, but almost no one knows the real Sherman Hemsley. For more than a decade, Sherman Hemsley lit up American living rooms as the star of the Jeffersons. He played a self-made businessman, a proud, sharp-tongued black man who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. In real life, fans assumed he was just as bold, confident, outspoken. But the truth? It couldn't be further from the truth. In real life, Sherman was incredibly shy, soft-spoken, very reserved. While his character told jokes and made headlines, Sherman himself quietly retreated from the spotlight, doing everything he could to keep one part of his life private, his sexuality. Unlike many of his Hollywood peers, Sherman never gave interviews about his dating life, never brought a partner to public events, never even reported on romantic relationships. For years, the tabloids had little to no information about, because Sherman kept his private life more private than most. Some close friends say he never even discussed it behind closed doors, not out of shame, but out of fear, fearing that coming out as gay would ruin the career he had built. And worse, erase the groundbreaking image of George Jefferson, one of the first successful and powerful black characters on American television. Throughout the 70s and 80s, being black and famous was subject to endless scrutiny. Being black, famous, and gay? That seemed like a risk Sherman couldn't take. So he remained single in public, lived alone, rarely attended industry parties, and while fans laughed at his on-screen ostentation, few realized that the man behind the character commuted home every night to silence. After the Jeffersons ended, Sherman continued to act, taking smaller roles, but never stepped into the spotlight that required interviews about his personal life. Even as rumors circulated for decades, Sherman never confirmed, never denied. Just smiled, gave brief answers, and changed the subject. It wasn't until 2012 when Sherman Hemsley died of lung cancer, the truth, which many insiders had known for years, quietly emerged. Actor Garrett Morris, his longtime friend and colleague, publicly confirmed that Sherman was gay, but chose, until the very last minute, to keep that part of himself away from the cameras, away from fans, and in many ways, away from himself. Reflecting on Sherman's story, it's hard not to wonder, how would his life have been different if he had felt safe enough to live fully? With every laugh, with every catchphrase, with every iconic TV moment, there was a man sitting quietly at home, living with a secret the world wasn't ready to hear. And perhaps that's the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the people who make us laugh the hardest are the ones who carry the heaviest silence. And that's our list. 10 black men who shaped music, comedy, movies, and history, but spent their lives hiding a simple truth. Some, like Sylvester and Bayard Rustin, lived boldly. Others, like Luther Vandross and Paul Winfield, stayed silent to survive. And some, like Little Richard and Richard Pryor, walked the painful line between insinuation and concealment. Their stories remind us of how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. Which story has stayed with you the most? Leave your thoughts below, like, subscribe, and join us next time for more untold stories that matter. Thanks for watching.